The red envelope with the elegant script caught my eye the moment I stepped through our front door. February 14th, 6:47 p.m., and there it was, propped against the crystal vase on our marble entryway table like some romantic movie scene. Except, it wasn't addressed to me. The flowing handwriting spelled out, "My darling Michael," in burgundy ink, and my heart stopped for exactly 3 seconds before my mind kicked into overdrive with the clarity that only comes when your world tilts sideways. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I stood there in my designer coat, still holding the bottle of Dom Perignon I'd picked up to surprise my husband for Valentine's Day, watching the steam from my breath disappear in our suddenly too cold foyer. The house felt different somehow, like the air itself was holding secrets. Michael's Mercedes wasn't in the driveway when I'd pulled up, which meant he was still at his marketing firm, probably working late again on what he called the Henderson account that had been consuming his evenings for the past 3 months. The envelope wasn't sealed. It sat there like an invitation to discover something I wasn't sure I wanted to know. My hands, steady from years of balancing million-dollar hospital budgets at Cedar Ridge Medical Center, trembled just slightly as I set down the champagne and reached for what would become the first piece of evidence in a puzzle I didn't even know I was solving yet. The letter inside was written on expensive cream stationery, the kind you buy at boutique shops downtown, not the office supply store. The handwriting was definitely feminine, with little hearts dotting the eyes and flourishes. That spoke of someone who still believed in fairy tale romance. As I unfolded it, a photograph slipped out and fluttered to the floor. My stomach dropped when I saw it was a picture of Michael, my husband of 8 years, kissing a brunette woman I didn't recognize on what appeared to be the deck of his family's lake house. "My dearest Michael," the letter began, "I can't stop thinking about our weekend together. When you told me your wife would be working late at the hospital again, I knew it was fate bringing us together. The way you held me under the stars, promising that soon we wouldn't have to hide anymore, made me believe in love again." I read that line 3 times, each reading driving the knife deeper. Working late at the hospital. I had been working late, pulling 18-hour days to finalize the budget for our new cardiac wing. While I'd been fighting to save the hospital's expansion project, Michael had been at the lake house with this woman, using my dedication as an excuse for his betrayal. The letter continued with intimate details that made my cheeks burn with humiliation and rage. This Emma person wrote about their plans for a romantic getaway, about how she'd already started looking at apartments for them to share, about how Michael had promised her that his marriage was essentially over and he was just waiting for the right time to file for divorce. She thanked him for the beautiful necklace he'd given her, describing it in detail that made my blood run cold because I recognized it immediately. It was my grandmother's vintage sapphire pendant, the one I kept in my jewelry box upstairs, the one Michael had access to but no right to give away. I sank onto the velvet bench by our staircase, the letter still clutched in my hands, as the full scope of Michael's deception began to crystallize. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a recent mistake. This was systematic, calculated, and had been going on for months. The woman wrote about their 3-month anniversary as if they were high school sweethearts, complete with inside jokes and references to conversations I'd never been part of. She mentioned how understanding she was about his need to keep up appearances with his wife until the business deal went through, how patient she was being about their secret relationship. Business deal. I sat up straighter, my finance director instincts kicking in. What business deal? Michael's consulting firm had been struggling lately, losing clients to larger agencies with bigger digital marketing capabilities. He'd been stressed about money, talking about needing to make some major changes to stay competitive. But he'd never mentioned any significant business deal that would require maintaining appearances in his marriage. I walked slowly through our house, really looking at it for the first time in months. The renovated kitchen with its granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, the hardwood floors I'd insisted on refinishing last year, the crown molding Michael had complained about but eventually agreed to install. Every improvement, every upgrade, every beautiful detail had been funded by my inheritance from my grandmother and my steadily increasing salary at the hospital. Michael's income from his struggling consulting firm barely covered his car payment and country club membership. Our wedding photos lined the hallway, 8 years of smiling faces at charity galas, hospital fundraisers, and romantic vacations. I stopped at the picture from our honeymoon in Tuscany, remembering how Michael had insisted on the most expensive resort despite our modest budget at the time. Even then, I'd been the one with the stable job and reliable income. Michael had been charming and ambitious, full of big dreams about building a marketing empire, but it was my pragmatic financial planning that had made our lifestyle possible. In his home office, I found more evidence of the life he'd been living without me. Credit card statements I'd never seen showed charges at expensive restaurants on nights he'd told me he was working late. There were receipts for jewelry purchases, weekend hotel stays, and shopping trips to boutiques where I'd never set foot. All of this was being funded by cash advances and credit cards I didn't know existed, hidden accounts that explained why. Our joint finances had seemed tighter lately despite my recent promotion. The most damning evidence was in his laptop, which he'd carelessly left open and logged in. His email revealed a correspondence spanning months with Emma Rodriguez, who worked as a social media manager at his firm. Their relationship had apparently begun as a professional collaboration on a client project and evolved into elaborate lunch meetings, after-work drinks, and eventually weekend getaways to his family's lake house while I worked overtime at the hospital. Emma's emails painted a picture of a woman completely infatuated with Michael, believing every lie he told her about his marriage being a mere formality, a business arrangement that would soon be dissolved. She wrote about their plans to merge their lives, about how she'd already given notice at her apartment and was preparing to move in with him once he handled things with his wife. The casual way they discussed my existence, as if I were simply an obstacle to be managed rather than a person with feelings and rights, made my hands shake with fury. But it was Michael's responses that truly revealed his character. He wrote to Emma with the same romantic intensity he'd once shown me, using phrases and promises that felt like echoes of our own courtship. He described me as controlling and career-obsessed, painting himself as a victim trapped in a loveless marriage to a woman who cared more about hospital budgets than her husband's happiness. He promised Emma that once his big client deal was finalized, he'd have the financial security to leave me and start fresh with her. The big client deal, I realized with growing horror, wasn't about his business at all. It was about our assets. Michael had been consulting with a financial advisor about liquidating investments, cashing out retirement accounts, and restructuring our holdings in ways that would give him access to funds while protecting them from division in a potential divorce. He was planning to take everything he could and disappear, leaving me with the debt from his secret credit cards and the fallout from his professional failures. I found printouts of property valuations for our house, research into Texas divorce laws, and most shocking of all, a consultation agreement with a divorce attorney dated 6 weeks ago. Michael wasn't just having an affair, he was actively planning to abandon our marriage while stripping away everything I'd worked to build. The man I'd supported through career setbacks, the husband I'd encouraged to follow his dreams even when his business struggled, was preparing to betray me in the most comprehensive way possible. My phone buzzed with a text message from Michael himself, sent from what I now knew was probably Emma's apartment. "Working late again tonight, don't wait up. Love you." The casual lie, delivered with mock affection, felt like a slap across the face. How many times had I received similar messages over the past 3 months? How many nights had I eaten dinner alone, believing my husband was building our future while he was actually dismantling it? I called my best friend Rachel Chen, needing to hear a familiar voice before I completely lost my composure. Rachel had been my roommate in college, my maid of honor at my wedding, and the one person who'd never been completely convinced that Michael was worthy of me. She'd seen something in his charm that felt calculated, though she'd never voiced her concerns directly. "Sarah? What's wrong?" Rachel's voice was immediately concerned. "You sound terrible." "I found letters," I said simply, and then the whole story poured out. The Valentine's Day discovery, the photographs, the emails, the financial planning, everything. Rachel listened without interruption, and I could hear her moving around what sounded like her downtown law office, probably working late on one of her corporate cases. "Where are you right now?" she asked when I'd finished. "At the house. Michael's still out, probably with her." "Don't do anything dramatic," Rachel warned. "Don't confront him, don't destroy evidence, don't make any emotional decisions. If what you're telling me is accurate, this is about much more than infidelity. This is financial fraud, and you need to protect yourself legally before you do anything else." Rachel's calm, analytical response helped center me. As a corporate attorney, she understood the legal implications of Michael's actions in ways that my emotional brain couldn't process. Her advice to preserve evidence and seek professional counsel before taking action made perfect sense, even though every fiber of my being wanted to throw his belongings onto the front lawn and change the locks immediately. "There's something else," I said, remembering a detail from Emma's letter. She mentioned that he gave her my grandmother's necklace. The sapphire pendant. Rachel's sharp intake of breath told me she understood the significance. That necklace wasn't just valuable, it was my inheritance, a family heirloom that had belonged to my grandmother and her mother before her. Michael had no legal right to give it away, and doing so constituted theft regardless of our marital status. "Sarah, listen to me carefully," Rachel said. "You need to document everything you've found tonight. Take photographs of the letters. Print out the emails, make copies of those financial documents. But don't let Michael know you've discovered any of this. If he realizes you're onto him, he might accelerate his timeline and try to move assets before you can protect yourself." The wisdom of her advice was clear, but the emotional weight of maintaining a facade felt overwhelming. How do you pretend everything is normal when you've just discovered your entire marriage is a lie? How do you smile and make conversation with someone who's been systematically planning to destroy your life? "Can you come over tomorrow while he's at work?" I asked. "I need help figuring out what to do next." "I'll be there at 9 a.m., Rachel promised. "And Sarah?" "I'm sorry. I know this is devastating, but we're going to handle this the right way. Michael thinks he's been clever, but he made one crucial mistake." "What's that?" "He underestimated you." After hanging up with Rachel, I spent the next 3 hours methodically documenting Michael's betrayal. I photographed every letter, every email, every financial document. I created a secure cloud folder with copies of everything, protecting the evidence from any attempt Michael might make to destroy it. I researched the legal implications of his financial planning and began to understand just how comprehensive his deception had been. The house felt different now, like I was a stranger in my own home. Every familiar object seemed tainted by the knowledge of Michael's secret life. The bed we shared, where he'd been lying to me for months while planning his escape. The kitchen table where we'd discussed our future while he was actually planning my financial ruin. The couch where we'd watched movies together while he was sending love letters to another woman. By the time I heard Michael's car in the driveway, it was nearly midnight. I'd had hours to process the discovery, to move through the initial shock and hurt into something more focused and determined. I was sitting in our living room with a book when he came through the front door, looking guilty and distracted. "Hey, babe," he said, kissing my forehead with the same casual affection he'd been faking for months. "Sorry I'm so late. The Henderson project is turning into a nightmare." "No problem," I replied, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "How was your day?" Michael launched into an elaborate story about client meetings and deadline pressures, all of which I now knew were lies covering for his time with Emma. I watched him perform this fiction with the same attention I gave to hospital budget presentations. Noting the details, cataloging the deceptions, beginning to understand the full scope of the man I'd married. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He outlined the steps for filing for divorce on grounds of adultery, which in Texas could affect the division of any jointly held property. Most importantly, he helped me understand that Michael's consultation with his own divorce attorney had actually worked in my favor. He's created a paper trail of premeditation, David noted. These emails discussing hiding assets and this consultation agreement show he's been planning this systematically. That level of calculation actually makes his case much worse than if this had been an impulsive affair. The forensic accountant, Lisa Park, arrived at David's office later that afternoon with a preliminary analysis of Michael's financial activity. She'd been able to access records from the credit cards and accounts I'd discovered, painting a picture of systematic deception that was even more extensive than I'd realized. Your husband has been living a completely separate financial life, Lisa explained, showing me spreadsheets and charts that mapped out his spending. Restaurant bills, hotel charges, shopping expenses, even what appears to be rent payments for an apartment I suspect he's been sharing with this Emma person. The apartment revelation hit me like a physical blow. Michael hadn't just been having an affair, he'd been maintaining a second residence, essentially living a double life with Emma while coming home to me each night and pretending our marriage was intact. How is he funding all of this? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect the answer. Lisa's expression was grim. Credit cards opened in your name using your social security number and employment information. Cash advances against your home equity line of credit that you probably didn't know existed. He's also been slowly liquidating some of your smaller investment accounts, taking amounts small enough that you might not notice immediately. The scope of Michael's financial betrayal was staggering. He'd been stealing from me for months, using my excellent credit and stable income to fund his affair while planning to leave me with the debt. The man I'd trusted with my financial future had been systematically robbing me to pay for his new life with Emma. Can we recover the money? I asked. Most of it, David assured me. Because the accounts were opened fraudulently and the spending was for non-marital purposes, we can document this as theft. The credit card companies will likely reverse the charges once we provide evidence of the fraud, and we can pursue recovery of the liquidated investments through the divorce proceedings. That evening, I sat in our living room waiting for Michael to come home, armed with new knowledge and a growing sense of my own power in this situation. When he walked through the door at 7:30, claiming another late night at the office, I watched him with completely different eyes. How was your day? He asked, settling beside me on the couch with the easy familiarity of 8 years of marriage. Productive, I said truthfully. I've been thinking about our finances lately. Maybe we should sit down this weekend and review our investments, make sure we're on track for our goals. Michael's face flickered with something that might have been panic before he recovered his composure. Sure, that sounds good. Though things are pretty crazy at work right now with this big presentation coming up. The big presentation. I now knew this was his cover story for the timeline he'd given Emma about when he'd be ready to leave me. According to her letters, he'd promised her they could be together openly once he wrapped up his business obligations at the end of the month. What's the presentation about? I asked innocently. Michael launched into an elaborate fiction about a potential client that would revolutionize his consulting firm. As he spoke, I marveled at his creativity in constructing lies. He'd always been a good storyteller, which had initially attracted me to him, but I was beginning to understand that this skill had a much darker application than I'd ever realized. That sounds exciting, I said when he finished. I'm proud of how hard you've been working. The guilt that flashed across his face was almost comical. Here I was, expressing support and admiration, while he was planning to destroy my life and steal my assets. For a moment, I wondered if he felt any genuine remorse for what he was doing, but his quick recovery suggested that his conscience had been overwhelmed by his sense of entitlement. Over the next few days, I maintained the facade of normalcy, while secretly implementing the strategy my legal team had developed. I opened new bank accounts that Michael didn't know about and began transferring funds to protect them from his access. I changed passwords on our investment accounts and set up alerts that would notify me of any attempted transactions. Most importantly, I began documenting Michael's daily lies about his whereabouts and activities. The surveillance wasn't necessary from a legal standpoint, since I already had more than enough evidence of his infidelity and financial fraud. But I needed to understand the full scope of his deception, and I found myself almost fascinated by the elaborate lengths he went to in order to maintain his double life. Michael would leave for work each morning at 8 o'clock, but according to the private investigator Lisa had recommended, he rarely arrived at his office before 10. Those 2 hours were spent at Emma's apartment, which explained why he always seemed refreshed and energetic when he came home, despite his claims of working long, stressful days. The apartment itself was a revelation. Located in a trendy downtown complex, it was far nicer than anything Michael could afford on his legitimate income. The rent, I learned, was being paid through one of the credit cards he'd opened in my name, meaning I was unknowingly funding his love nest with Emma. Emma Rodriguez turned out to be exactly what I'd imagined from her letters. 28 years old, attractive in a conventional way, with an Instagram account full of inspirational quotes about following your dreams and finding true love. She worked as a social media manager at Michael's consulting firm, which explained how their relationship had developed, but her online presence suggested someone who was genuinely naive about the reality of her situation with Michael. Her social media posts over the past 3 months told the story of someone falling deeply in love, sharing cryptic messages about complicated situations and waiting for the right moment that clearly referred to her relationship with my husband. She posted photos of expensive gifts that I now knew Michael had bought with stolen money, romantic dinners at restaurants I'd never been to, and weekend getaways to places Michael had told me were business trips. The most painful part wasn't the evidence of their physical relationship or even their emotional connection. It was seeing how completely Michael had recreated with Emma the early days of our own relationship. The same restaurants where he'd taken me 8 years ago, the same gifts and gestures that had made me fall in love with him, even some of the same romantic phrases I remembered from our own courtship. Michael was essentially running the same playbook with Emma that he'd used with me, which made me wonder how many other women there had been over the years. "Oh, I almost forgot," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. "Happy Valentine's Day." He handed me a small wrapped box that contained a pair of earrings, pretty but inexpensive, the kind of gift you pick up at the last minute to maintain appearances. "They're lovely," I said, accepting his kiss and feeling like an actress in a play where only I knew the real script. "Thank you." That night, lying beside Michael as he slept peacefully, I stared at the ceiling and began to plan. Rachel was right that I needed professional help, legal advice, and a strategic approach to protecting myself. But more than that, I needed Michael to understand that the woman he'd been deceiving, the wife he thought he could manipulate and discard, was far more capable than he'd ever imagined. The letters from Emma had revealed something important about Michael's timeline. He was planning to wait until after a major business presentation next month before making his move, believing that finalizing this client relationship would give him the credibility and financial cushion he needed to start over with Emma. He thought he had time to execute his plan carefully, methodically, without my knowledge. What Michael didn't know was that I'd already begun executing a plan of my own. The skills that made me successful at managing hospital finances, anticipating problems, and developing strategic solutions were about to be applied to the most important project of my life, ensuring that Michael's betrayal would cost him everything while leaving me stronger than ever. As I finally drifted off to sleep, my last thought was about the look on Michael's face when he would eventually realize that the quiet, dedicated wife he'd been deceiving was actually the architect of his downfall. He'd spent months underestimating me, and that mistake was going to cost him far more than he could possibly imagine. The morning after my Valentine's Day discovery, I woke up at 5:30 a.m. with a clarity that surprised me. Michael was still sleeping soundly beside me, completely unaware that his carefully constructed double life had been exposed. I slipped out of bed quietly and made my way to the kitchen, where I sat with my coffee and began to piece together the timeline of his deception. Rachel arrived at exactly 9 o'clock, as promised, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the serious expression she reserved for her most important cases. Michael had left for work an hour earlier, kissing me goodbye with the same casual affection that now felt like another performance in his elaborate charade. "Show me everything," Rachel said without preamble, settling at our dining room table. I spread out printed copies of all the evidence I'd gathered the night before. The love letters from Emma, the email exchanges, the financial documents, the consultation agreement with the divorce attorney. Rachel examined each piece methodically, making notes in her legal pad and occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates and details. "This is worse than I thought," she said finally, looking up from a particularly damning email where Michael discussed hiding assets from me. "Sarah, your husband isn't just having an affair. He's been planning to defraud you for months, possibly longer." The word fraud hung in the air between us like a physical presence. I'd spent the night thinking of Michael's actions as betrayal and deception, but hearing Rachel frame it in legal terms made the severity of the situation crystallize. "What exactly are my options?" I asked. Rachel set down her pen and looked at me directly. "First, we need to understand something important. You're not in a position of weakness here, despite how it might feel. Michael has made several critical mistakes that actually put you in a very strong legal position." She began counting off points on her fingers. "He's documented his intent to hide marital assets, which is illegal in Texas. He's given away your inherited property without permission, which is theft. He's been using credit in your name without your knowledge to fund his affair, which could constitute identity theft. And most importantly, he doesn't seem to realize that you're far more financially savvy than he is." That last point resonated deeply. Throughout our marriage, I'd let Michael believe he was the financial decision-maker while I quietly managed the actual money. He signed documents I prepared, attended meetings I scheduled, and took credit for investment strategies I researched and implemented. His ego required him to be seen as the provider, so I'd allowed him that illusion while maintaining actual control over our assets. "There's something else," I said, retrieving a folder from my home office. "I've been protecting our assets in ways Michael doesn't know about." Rachel's eyebrows rose as I showed her the documentation. "When we'd bought our house 3 years ago, I'd insisted the deed be in my name only, citing tax advantages and liability protection related to my position at the hospital." Michael had barely glanced at the paperwork, trusting my explanation and eager to close on the property. Similarly, our investment accounts were structured to give me primary control, with Michael as a secondary beneficiary rather than joint owner. "He thinks everything is jointly owned," I explained, "but legally, most of our major assets are mine alone. I set it up this way after watching my sister's messy divorce, but Michael never paid attention to the details." Rachel smiled. "For the first time since arriving. So while he's been planning to take half of what he thinks are marital assets, he actually has legal claim to very little." "Exactly. His name is on some of the smaller accounts and credit cards, but the house, the major investments, even the cars are all in my name or protected in ways he doesn't understand." We spent the next 2 hours developing a comprehensive strategy. Rachel recommended a forensic accountant to analyze Michael's hidden spending and document the fraud. She gave me the contact information for David Walsh, a divorce attorney who specialized in high-asset cases involving financial deception. Most importantly, she helped me understand the timeline that would give me maximum advantage. The key is to move quickly but carefully, Rachel explained. Michael thinks he has weeks to finalize his plan, but if we act now, we can secure everything before he realizes what's happening. I called in sick to work, something I'd done perhaps 3 times in 8 years, and spent the day assembling my legal team. David Walsh agreed to see me that afternoon, and his initial assessment confirmed Rachel's optimism about my position. Mrs. Mitchell, David said after reviewing my documentation, I've been practicing family law for 25 years, and I've rarely seen a case where one spouse has unknowingly given the other such a strategic advantage. Your husband's documented intent to defraud you, combined with your legitimate ownership of the major assets, makes this a very straightforward case from a legal standpoint. David explained the process of freezing assets to prevent Michael from moving money or making large purchases. Martinez wants to discuss the cardiac wing budget revisions, Jennifer said, reviewing my calendar. And the Finance Committee meeting has been moved to Wednesday afternoon. I smiled and nodded, appreciating how my professional world remained stable and predictable while everything else shifted beneath my feet. My work at the hospital had always been my sanctuary, the place where my competence and intelligence were recognized and valued. Michael had never fully understood or appreciated my career, seeing it more as a convenient source of income than a reflection of my capabilities. At exactly 10 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from David. Documents filed. Process servers dispatched. Phase 1 complete. I felt a surge of satisfaction reading those words while reviewing pharmaceutical budget allocations. The contrast between my calm professional demeanor and the legal earthquake I'd just triggered would have amused me if the stakes weren't so serious. Lisa Park called during my lunch break with an update on the financial investigation. We've identified 17 different credit accounts opened in your name without authorization, she reported. Total fraudulent charges exceed $47,000, all spent on non-marital expenses related to his affair. The number was staggering but not entirely surprising. Michael had been funding an elaborate second life for months, paying for Emma's apartment, expensive dinners, weekend getaways, and gifts that she'd posted proudly on social media. What made his theft particularly galling was how carefully he'd calculated the amounts, staying just below thresholds that might trigger automatic alerts or require my authorization. The good news is that we have clear documentation for every fraudulent transaction, Lisa continued. The credit card companies are already beginning the reversal process now that we've filed criminal charges. They take identity theft very seriously, especially when it's this systematic. Criminal charges. The phrase still felt surreal, even though I'd been building toward this moment for weeks. Michael wasn't just facing divorce anymore, he was looking at potential jail time for theft, fraud, and identity theft. The man who'd thought he could manipulate and abandon me was about to discover that actions have consequences he'd never considered. Rachel joined me for lunch at a quiet restaurant near the hospital, bringing updates from her own investigation into Michael's business dealings. Her corporate connections had provided insights into Mitchell Associates that painted an even grimmer picture than we'd initially understood. His consulting firm is essentially bankrupt, Rachel said quietly, scanning the restaurant to ensure we weren't overheard. 3 of his largest clients have terminated their contracts in the past month, citing missed deadlines and poor communication. The office lease is 2 months behind, and he's been avoiding calls from vendors demanding payment. This explained Michael's increasingly desperate financial maneuvers. His business was collapsing, threatening both his income and his self-image. As a successful entrepreneur, rather than face this failure honestly or ask for help, he'd chosen to steal from me while planning his escape with Emma. The cowardice of his approach was almost more offensive than the theft itself. There's more, Rachel continued. I spoke with someone who used to work there. Apparently, Michael's been telling clients that he's bringing in a major new partner, someone with significant capital who will stabilize the firm's finances. Want to guess who he's been describing? The realization hit me like ice water. He's been using me as collateral for his business deals without my knowledge. Exactly. He's been promising potential clients access to your hospital connections and possibly your personal investment capital. Several people mentioned meetings where he discussed his wife's important position at Cedar Ridge and her substantial financial resources. Michael had been essentially selling my reputation and assets to prop up his failing business, making commitments on my behalf that I'd never agreed to and couldn't fulfill. The scope of his deception extended far beyond personal betrayal into professional fraud that could have damaged my own career if his schemes had continued. My phone rang as we finished lunch. The caller ID showed Emma Rodriguez, and I let it go to voicemail before listening to her message in my car. Her voice was shaky, confused, clearly distressed about something that had happened. "Mrs. Mitchell, this is Emma Rodriguez. I work with your husband at his consulting firm. I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding, and I really need to speak with you. Could you please call me back? It's urgent." A misunderstanding. The naivety in her voice was almost touching. Emma had clearly been contacted by someone, possibly process servers or investigators, and was beginning to realize that her romantic fantasy with Michael wasn't quite the reality she'd believed. I forwarded the voicemail to David Walsh and deleted it without responding. The afternoon brought a steady stream of updates from my legal team. The process servers had successfully located Michael at Emma's apartment, delivering divorce papers and criminal complaints with the dramatic timing we'd carefully orchestrated. According to their report, Michael's reaction had been shock followed by fury, with Emma becoming hysterical as the implications became clear. David called at 3:30 with additional details. Your husband immediately contacted 3 different attorneys before finding one willing to represent him. Apparently, most of the family law firms in Austin declined the case once they saw the evidence of systematic fraud. The attorney who'd finally agreed to represent Michael was Jake Morrison, known for taking difficult cases that other lawyers avoided. His reputation was more about aggressive tactics than legal skill, which suggested Michael was already scraping the bottom of the barrel for representation. Morrison called my office demanding immediate negotiation, David continued. He claims this is all a misunderstanding that can be resolved without criminal charges. I told him we'd be happy to discuss his client's surrender of all fraudulently obtained assets and his agreement to permanent departure from your residence. Had our entire marriage been an elaborate performance on his part, a convenient arrangement that provided him with financial stability and social respectability while he pursued his real interests elsewhere? Rachel called me Thursday evening with an update on her own research into Michael's business activities. As a corporate attorney with connections throughout Austin's business community, she'd been able to gather intelligence about Mitchell Associates that painted a troubling picture. His consulting firm is in much worse shape than you probably realize, she told me. They've lost 3 major clients in the past 6 months, and there are rumors about unpaid bills and missed deadlines. Several people I've spoken with suggest that Michael's been distracted and unreliable lately. This explained some of the financial pressure that had driven Michael to steal from our accounts. His business was failing, which threatened both his income and his self-image as a successful entrepreneur. Rather than confess his professional problems to me and work together on a solution, he'd chosen to fund his lifestyle through fraud while planning to abandon me once he'd taken everything he could. There's something else, Rachel continued. I did some research on Emma Rodriguez, and her employment history is interesting. She's worked at 4 different companies in the past 5 years, always leaving under circumstances that suggest workplace relationships with supervisors that ended badly. The pattern was becoming clear. Emma might not be the innocent victim I'd initially assumed. Her history suggested someone who had made a habit of getting involved with married supervisors, and her rapid emotional attachment to Michael might have been calculated rather than genuine. Friday morning brought a development that accelerated my timeline dramatically. Michael announced over breakfast that he needed to take a business trip the following week, traveling to Dallas for meetings with potential clients. The trip would keep him away for 3 days, which he presented as an inconvenience but I recognized as an opportunity. "When exactly will you be leaving?" I asked, already planning how to use his absence. "Monday morning, back Wednesday evening," he said, not meeting my eyes as he spoke. "I hate to be away from you, but this could be the breakthrough the firm needs." I nodded sympathetically while internally celebrating. 3 days would give me time to implement the final phase of my plan without having to maintain the exhausting pretense of marital normalcy. More importantly, Michael's absence would provide the perfect opportunity to reclaim our home and secure my assets without the risk of confrontation. That afternoon, I met with David Walsh to finalize our strategy for the following week. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness. While Michael was supposedly in Dallas, David would file for divorce on grounds of adultery and financial fraud. Simultaneously, we would freeze all accounts Michael had access to and file criminal charges for identity theft and embezzlement. "The key is coordination," David explained. "We want everything to happen simultaneously so he can't respond to one action by accelerating another part of his plan." I would remain at work during the day, maintaining my normal routine to avoid any suspicion. But by Wednesday evening, when Michael returned from his supposed business trip, he would find himself locked out of our house, served with divorce papers, and facing both civil and criminal charges for his theft. "What about Emma?" I asked. "Should I expect her to contact me or cause problems?" David smiled grimly. "Based on what your investigator has learned about her, I suspect Emma will disappear very quickly once she realizes Michael has no money and significant legal troubles. People like her are typically more interested in the lifestyle than the person providing it." That weekend, Michael was unusually attentive, perhaps sensing that something had changed even though he couldn't identify what. He suggested we go out for dinner Saturday night, to our favorite restaurant downtown, and for a moment I almost felt nostalgic for the early days of our marriage when such gestures had been genuine. But sitting across from him at the candlelit table, watching him smile and make conversation while knowing he was planning to destroy my life, I felt only a cold determination to see this through to the end. Michael had made his choices, and now he would face the consequences of underestimating the woman he'd tried to betray. Sunday evening, as Michael packed for his supposed business trip, I helped him select shirts and ties with the same loving attention I'd always shown. He seemed almost nervous, perhaps because he knew this trip was actually his cover for finalizing arrangements with Emma, or perhaps because some part of him sensed the trap that was closing around him. "I'll miss you," he said, kissing me goodbye. Monday morning with what seemed like genuine emotion. "I'll miss you too," I replied, and meant it in a way he couldn't possibly understand. I would miss the Michael I'd thought I married, the man I'd believed existed beneath the lies and betrayal. But that man had never been real, and it was time to stop grieving for a fiction. As his car disappeared down our street, I felt a sense of freedom I hadn't experienced in months. The performance was over, and the reckoning was about to begin. Monday morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of February sunshine that made Austin feel alive with possibility. I watched Michael load his suitcase into his Mercedes from our bedroom window, noting how carefully he'd packed, as if this trip actually mattered to his business rather than being an elaborate cover for his plans with Emma. He'd kissed me goodbye with unusual tenderness, perhaps guilt making him more affectionate, or maybe he was already mentally rehearsing his new life. 20 minutes after his car disappeared around the corner, I was on the phone with David Walsh, confirming that our carefully orchestrated plan was ready to begin. The legal machinery we'd spent weeks preparing was about to spring into action. with precision timing that would have impressed my hospital administrators. All documents are prepared and ready for filing, David confirmed. The forensic accountant has completed her analysis, the private investigator has submitted his final report, and we have cooperation from the credit card companies regarding the fraudulent accounts. Are you ready to proceed? I looked around. Our bedroom, taking in the wedding photos on the dresser, the matching furniture we'd selected together, the California king bed where Michael had been lying to me for months while planning my financial destruction. I'm ready. David would file the divorce papers at 10 a.m., precisely when Michael's phone records showed he typically arrived at Emma's apartment for their morning rendezvous. The timing wasn't accidental. We wanted him distracted and off guard when the legal tsunami began. At 8:30, I drove to Cedar Ridge Medical Center as if this were any normal Monday. My assistant Jennifer greeted me with her usual efficiency, handing me a stack of budget reports and reminding me about the board meeting scheduled for Thursday. The familiar routine of hospital administration provided a comforting anchor while my personal life underwent its controlled demolition. Dr. The speed of their response indicated panic rather than strategy. A competent attorney would have taken time to review the evidence and develop a thoughtful approach. Instead, Michael had clearly demanded immediate action to try to contain a situation that was already beyond his control. At 4 o'clock, my work phone rang with a call from Michael himself. I let it go to voicemail, listening to his message later with a mixture of fascination and disgust. His voice was strained, alternating between anger and what sounded like desperation. "Sarah, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this has gone too far. These accusations are ridiculous, and you know it. I need you to call off your lawyers immediately so we can discuss this like adults. Whatever problems we're having in our marriage, we can work them out without involving the legal system." The audacity was breathtaking. Michael had spent months systematically stealing from me while planning to abandon our marriage, but now he wanted to work things out like adults because his plan had been exposed. He still seemed to believe he could manipulate me into protecting him from the consequences of his own actions. I forwarded his voicemail to David with instructions to document it as evidence of attempted intimidation. Any direct contact from Michael at this point violated the restraining order we'd filed along with the divorce papers, making his calls additional evidence of his disregard for legal boundaries. Tuesday morning brought news that Michael had been forced to close his consulting firm immediately. With the criminal charges now public record, his remaining clients had terminated their contracts, and his business partners had distanced themselves from the scandal. The professional reputation he'd worked years to build was collapsing as rapidly as his personal life. Emma Rodriguez called the hospital directly, somehow obtaining my work number and attempting to reach me through the main switchboard. Jennifer intercepted the call and took a message, which I found amusing in its desperation. She said it was urgent hospital business, Jennifer reported, clearly skeptical. When I asked which department she was calling about, she couldn't give me a coherent answer. Should I add her to the blocked caller list? Please do, I said, appreciating Jennifer's protective instincts. And if she calls again, just take a message without putting her through. The message Emma had left revealed her growing panic as the reality of her situation became clear. She claimed Michael had told her I was mentally unstable and vindictive, that the criminal charges were fabricated revenge for his decision to leave our marriage. She wanted to meet with me to clear the air and find an amicable solution to what she called our mutual problem. David Walsh's response to Emma's message was swift and decisive. His office sent her a formal cease and desist letter, warning that any further attempts to contact me directly would be considered harassment and could result in additional criminal charges. The letter also informed her that she was being investigated as a potential accomplice in Michael's financial crimes, given her knowledge of his fraudulent activities and her acceptance of stolen property. The possibility that Emma could face criminal charges herself was something we'd discussed but hadn't pursued initially. However, her attempts to contact me and her apparent coordination with Michael's attorney suggested she might be more involved in his schemes than her innocent act indicated. Lisa Park's continued investigation revealed that Emma had been living well beyond her legitimate income for months, funding an expensive lifestyle with money that clearly came from Michael's theft. Her apartment lease, car payments, and credit card purchases all suggested access to funds that exceeded her salary as a social media manager. She's either incredibly naive about where the money was coming from, or she's an active participant in the fraud, Lisa observed during our Tuesday afternoon conference call. Either way, she's legally vulnerable as someone who benefited from criminal activity. Wednesday brought the moment I'd been anticipating and dreading in equal measure. Michael's supposed business trip was scheduled to end that evening, meaning he would return to find his world completely transformed. The house locks had been changed Tuesday morning, security cameras installed, and legal notices posted on all entrances. I spent Wednesday at work maintaining my normal routine, attending meetings and reviewing reports as if my husband weren't facing criminal charges and my marriage wasn't officially over. The ability to compartmentalize my emotions and focus on professional responsibilities had served me well throughout this crisis. Dr. Martinez stopped by my office Wednesday afternoon to commend me on the cardiac wing budget analysis. "Your financial projections were absolutely accurate," he said. "The board is very impressed with your work on this expansion project." The irony wasn't lost on me that my professional success was reaching new heights just as my personal life underwent its systematic demolition. Michael had always underestimated my capabilities, seeing my career as secondary to his own ambitions. Now my competence and strategic thinking were ensuring his complete downfall while my reputation remained untarnished. At 5:30, I drove home to prepare for Michael's return. The house felt different with the new security system and changed locks, more like a fortress than a home. I'd spent Tuesday evening removing the last traces of Michael's presence, packing his remaining belongings into boxes that would be available for supervised pickup once his attorney arranged it. The transformation of our shared space into my private sanctuary was emotionally liberating. Every room now reflected only my preferences, free from the compromises and accommodations that had characterized our marriage. The house had always been legally mine, but now it felt emotionally reclaimed as well. David Walsh called at 6 p.m. with a final update before Michael's expected arrival. His attorney has been trying to negotiate all day, offering everything from immediate asset surrender to voluntary departure from the state. Morrison clearly recognizes how weak their position is. "What are you telling them?" "That we'll consider discussing terms once your husband surrenders himself for booking on the criminal charges. Until then, any civil negotiations are premature." The idea of Michael being arrested and processed like a common criminal felt surreal, but it was the natural consequence of his systematic theft and fraud. He'd spent months treating me like a victim to be exploited rather than a partner to be respected. Now he would discover that victims could become prosecutors when they were smart enough and angry enough to fight back. At 7:15, right on schedule, Michael's Mercedes pulled into our driveway. I watched from the living room window as he approached the front door, clearly expecting everything to be normal despite the legal papers he'd been served. The moment of recognition when he realized his key didn't work was almost comic in its surprise and confusion. He tried the door several times before noticing the security cameras and legal notices posted prominently on either side of the entrance. I could see his face change as he read the restraining order and the notice that he was no longer welcome on the property. The transformation from confident expectation to shocked realization was everything I'd hoped for. Michael immediately pulled out his phone, undoubtedly calling his attorney for guidance. The conversation appeared heated, with significant gesturing and what looked like frustrated pacing in our driveway. Whatever advice Morrison was giving him, it clearly wasn't what Michael wanted to hear. 20 minutes later, a police cruiser arrived in response to Michael's call claiming he was being illegally denied access to his home. The officers reviewed the legal documents, checked the property records on their system, and confirmed that Michael had no legal right to enter the house. Their conversation with him was brief and professional, ending with clear instructions to leave the property immediately or face arrest for trespassing. The sight of my husband being warned off our property by police officers should have felt victorious, but instead I felt only a profound sadness for the waste of what our marriage might have been. Michael had possessed everything he needed for happiness, a loving wife, financial security, professional opportunities, and social standing. He'd thrown it all away for the excitement of deception and the fantasy of a different life with Emma. As Michael's car disappeared into the evening, I poured myself a glass of wine and settled into my reclaimed living room. The house was quiet. In a way it hadn't been for months, free from the tension of maintaining pretenses and navigating Michael's elaborate lies. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the legal proceedings continued, but tonight I could simply exist in the peace of knowing that the worst was over. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. Saw the news about the arrest warrant. How are you feeling? I thought about her question as I sipped my wine and watched the sunset through windows that were now truly mine. How was I feeling? Relieved? Certainly. Vindicated? Absolutely. But most of all, I felt a profound sense of my own power and capability. Michael had spent our entire marriage underestimating me, and that miscalculation had ultimately destroyed him while leaving me stronger than ever. I feel free, I texted back, and meant it completely. Thursday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. Michael had spent the night at Emma's apartment, according to my security team's surveillance reports, but his attempts to reach me through increasingly desperate phone calls and text messages suggested their romantic hideaway was feeling more like a prison. The reality of his situation was clearly sinking in: no access to the house he'd called home, no legitimate income with his business collapsed, and mounting legal fees for criminal charges that grew more serious with each hour. The first call came at 6:15 a.m., well before I normally left for work. Michael's voice on the message was different from his previous attempts at contact, stripped of its usual confident charm and replaced with something that sounded almost pleading. "Sarah, please, you have to listen to me. I know how this looks, but there are explanations for everything. I never meant for things to go this far. Can we just talk? Just the two of us, without all these lawyers making everything worse? I miss you, and I know we can work this out if you'll just give me a chance." The manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting. Michael was using the same emotional tactics that had worked on me for years, appealing to my compassion and my desire to fix problems rather than confront them. But those days were over. I'd learned that some problems couldn't be fixed because they weren't accidents or misunderstandings, they were choices. I forwarded the voicemail to David Walsh and deleted it without a second thought. Michael's words meant nothing now because his actions had revealed his true character so completely. He'd had 8 years to choose honesty and partnership, and instead he'd chosen deception and theft. Dr. Martinez found me in my office at 7:30, earlier than usual for both of us. His expression was concerned but not judgmental, the look of someone who'd heard rumors but wanted to hear the truth from me directly. "Sarah, I hope you don't mind me asking, but there are some concerning stories circulating about your husband. The hospital administration wants to ensure that whatever personal issues you're dealing with won't impact your work or create any conflicts of interest." I appreciated his directness. Hospital politics could be treacherous, and personal scandals had destroyed careers more promising than mine. "Dr. Martinez, I'm in the process of divorcing my husband due to his infidelity and financial fraud. The criminal charges you may have heard about are legitimate and well documented. I've been completely transparent with our legal department, and there are no conflicts of interest with my hospital responsibilities." He nodded thoughtfully. "The board is very supportive of you personally and professionally. Your work on the cardiac wing expansion has been exemplary, and no one questions your integrity or competence. We just wanted to ensure you have whatever support you need during this difficult time. The conversation was a reminder that my professional reputation remained intact despite the chaos in my personal life. Michael's criminal behavior reflected on him alone, while my handling of the situation demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking and emotional stability that made me valuable to the hospital. Rachel called during my lunch break with updates that made Michael's situation even worse. Her investigation into his business practices had uncovered evidence of client fund misappropriation that went back months before his affair with Emma. He's been using client retainer fees to cover operating expenses, Rachel explained. It's classic embezzlement, using new client payments to cover obligations to previous clients while skimming money for personal expenses. The consulting firm was essentially a Ponzi scheme on a small scale. This revelation meant Michael's legal troubles extended far beyond identity theft and marital fraud. He'd been stealing from his business clients while simultaneously stealing from me, creating multiple streams of criminal liability that would make any plea negotiation extremely difficult. How many clients are we talking about? I asked. At least 6 that we've identified so far, possibly more. The total amount appears to be around $80,000, which elevates the charges to felony level in Texas. $80,000. The number was staggering, representing not just Michael's greed but his complete disregard for the trust his clients had placed in him. These were small business owners and entrepreneurs who'd hired him to help grow their companies, not to fund his extramarital affair and failing lifestyle. Emma Rodriguez made another attempt to reach me Thursday afternoon, this time appearing at the hospital and claiming to be a pharmaceutical sales representative with an urgent delivery for my department. Security called my office to verify her appointment, and I instructed them to escort her off the property and add her to the banned visitor list. She became quite agitated when we informed her that no appointment existed, the security supervisor reported. She insisted that there had been a misunderstanding and that you were expecting her. We had to threaten police involvement before she agreed to leave. Emma's desperation was escalating, which suggested that her situation with Michael was deteriorating rapidly. The financial support he'd been providing was obviously gone, and she was probably facing eviction from the apartment he'd been paying for with stolen money. Her attempts to reach me indicated she still believed this was some kind of misunderstanding that could be resolved through direct appeal rather than recognizing it as the criminal investigation it had become. David Walsh called at 4 p.m. with news that accelerated our timeline significantly. Michael's attorney has requested an emergency hearing for tomorrow morning. Morrison is claiming that the restraining order is overly broad and that your husband needs access to the house to retrieve essential personal items and business documents. What kind of business documents could he possibly need from a house where he conducted no legitimate business? That's exactly what we'll be arguing. Morrison is fishing for any technicality that might give his client some leverage or delay the criminal proceedings. Judge Harrison has agreed to hear arguments at 9 a.m. tomorrow. I'd been expecting some kind of desperate legal maneuver from Michael's attorney, but the timing suggested they were under significant pressure from either the criminal charges or Michael's growing list of creditors. A competent attorney would have spent more time building a case before requesting emergency hearings that were unlikely to succeed. Do you need me there? Yes, but only as an observer. Morrison might try to paint you as vindictive or unreasonable, so we want the judge to see you as composed and professional. Wear something conservative and bring your hospital identification to emphasize your legitimate career in contrast to your husband's criminal behavior. That evening, I prepared for what would likely be my first face-to-face encounter with Michael since discovering his betrayal. The prospect was emotionally challenging but not as difficult as I'd expected. The man I'd loved and trusted for 8 years had revealed himself to be someone else entirely, and I felt no lingering attachment to the fiction he presented. I selected a navy blue suit that projected authority without appearing aggressive, paired with the pearl necklace my grandmother had given me for my college graduation. The symbolism felt appropriate, representing the family legacy Michael had tried to steal and the educational achievements he'd never fully respected. Friday morning at the courthouse was my first glimpse of Michael since he'd left for his supposed business trip 5 days earlier. The transformation was shocking. His usually immaculate appearance had given way to wrinkled clothing, stubble, and the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't been sleeping well. He sat beside Jake Morrison at the defendant's table, occasionally glancing in my direction with expressions that alternated between anger and what might have been regret. Emma was conspicuously absent, which suggested that either she'd been advised to stay away or their relationship was already fracturing under the pressure of reality. The romantic fantasy she'd constructed couldn't survive the harsh light of criminal charges and financial ruin. Judge Harrison, a woman in her 60s known for no-nonsense rulings and impatience with frivolous motions, reviewed the case files with obvious skepticism about Michael's request. Morrison's opening argument was a masterpiece of legal desperation, claiming that Michael needed access to vital business records that were supposedly stored in our home office. Your Honor, Morrison began, my client's livelihood depends on accessing client files and financial records that are essential to his business operations. The blanket restraining order prevents him from retrieving materials that have nothing to do with the marital dispute. David Walsh's response was methodical and devastating. He presented evidence that Michael's consulting firm had been closed permanently, that his business license had been suspended due to client complaints, and that any legitimate business records had already been seized by investigators as evidence in the embezzlement charges. Your Honor, the defendant's supposed need for business documents is a transparent attempt to gain access to property he has no legal right to enter. All legitimate business materials are either in possession of the authorities or stored at his former office space, which he abandoned when he closed his firm to avoid creditors. Judge Harrison asked pointed questions about the specific documents Michael claimed to need, and Morrison's answers became increasingly vague and contradictory. It was clear that no such documents existed and that this was simply a fishing expedition designed to create opportunities for further manipulation or evidence destruction. Mr. Morrison, Judge Harrison said finally, your client's request is denied. The restraining order stands as written. If your client believes there are specific business documents in the residence that are relevant to his defense, you may file a detailed motion identifying those materials and their location. Any such motion must be accompanied by evidence that the documents exist and are necessary for legitimate legal purposes. Michael's face crumpled as the judge's ruling eliminated his last hope of regaining access to the house. Morrison whispered something urgent in his ear, probably advising him about the implications of this setback for his overall legal situation. As we left the courthouse, Michael broke away from his attorney and approached me directly, ignoring David Walsh's attempts to intervene. His voice was low and desperate, with none of the charm that had once attracted me. Sarah, please, you have to understand. Everything got out of hand, but I never meant to hurt you. Emma means nothing to me, she was just a mistake, a distraction. When I was feeling overwhelmed with work. I love you, I've always loved you, and I know we can fix this if you'll just stop this legal nightmare. The words that might once have moved me to forgiveness now felt like further manipulation. Michael was rewriting history to minimize his culpability, painting his systematic theft and elaborate deception as momentary lapses in judgment rather than deliberate choices made over months. Michael, I said quietly, aware that courthouse security was watching our interaction, you stole from me, you lied to me, and you planned to abandon me after taking everything you could. Those aren't mistakes or distractions, they're crimes. The legal system will determine the consequences. His face hardened as he realized that emotional manipulation wasn't going to work. You think you're so smart, don't you? So perfect and superior. But you're making a huge mistake. I know things about your precious hospital job that could destroy your career. I know about the budget discrepancies and the questionable contracts. If you don't drop these charges, I'll make sure everyone knows what you've really been doing." The threat was so desperate and obviously false that I almost felt sorry for him. Michael had never paid attention to my work at the hospital beyond its contribution to our income. He had no knowledge of budget processes or contract procedures. And his attempt at blackmail only demonstrated how completely he'd lost touch with reality. David Walsh stepped between us before I could respond. "Mr. Mitchell, you're in violation of the restraining order by approaching my client. Any further contact will result in immediate arrest. I suggest you return to your attorney and discuss how your behavior here today affects your criminal case." Security officers appeared to escort Michael away, and I watched him leave with Morrison, who was clearly frustrated by his client's impulsive behavior. The attempted intimidation had backfired completely, providing additional evidence of Michael's poor judgment and disregard for legal boundaries. That afternoon brought news that Emma Rodriguez had been arrested on charges related to receiving stolen property and conspiracy to commit fraud. Her acceptance of gifts purchased with money stolen from me, combined with her knowledge of Michael's fraudulent activities, had made her legally vulnerable as an accomplice. "She's trying to negotiate a plea deal," David informed me during our post-hearing debriefing. "Apparently, she's willing to testify against your husband in exchange for reduced charges." Her attorney contacted the prosecutor's office this morning. Emma's willingness to betray Michael wasn't surprising given her history of abandoning relationships when they became inconvenient. The romantic devotion she'd expressed in her love letters had evaporated quickly when faced with the prospect of criminal prosecution. What kind of testimony could she provide? Details about Michael's financial discussions, admissions he made about stealing from you, plans they discussed for using your assets after he left the marriage. She apparently recorded some of their conversations on her phone, thinking they were romantic mementos. The irony was perfect. Emma's sentimental recording of their intimate conversations had created evidence that would help convict the man she'd claimed to love. Her naivety about the legal implications of Michael's behavior was now providing prosecutors with exactly the kind of evidence they needed to ensure his conviction. Rachel joined me for dinner Friday evening, bringing updates on the media coverage that was beginning to emerge around Michael's case. The story had attracted attention because it combined romance, betrayal, and financial fraud in ways that made compelling reading for local news outlets. "They're portraying you very sympathetically," Rachel assured me. "The narrative is successful professional woman betrayed by manipulative husband who stole her money to fund affair. Your hospital position and community involvement make you a sympathetic figure, while Michael's business failures and criminal behavior make him an obvious villain." The media attention was uncomfortable but manageable. My professional reputation at the hospital remained strong, and the coverage actually reinforced my image as someone who'd handled a difficult situation with intelligence and grace rather than emotional dramatics. "There is one concern," Rachel continued. "A reporter from the Austin Business Journal has been asking questions about your personal finances, specifically about how you accumulated assets that Michael apparently believed were jointly owned. They're wondering if there are tax implications or undisclosed income sources." This was something we'd anticipated and prepared for. My financial success was entirely legitimate, based on inheritance, careful investing, and a steadily increasing salary at the hospital. The complex asset protection strategies I'd implemented were legal and well documented, designed to protect my holdings from exactly the kind of situation I was now facing. Should I be concerned? Not at all. David's team has prepared documentation showing the source of every asset and the legal basis for your ownership structure. If anything, the investigation will demonstrate how carefully and legitimately you've managed your finances in contrast to Michael's criminal behavior. As the weekend approached, I felt a sense of closure beginning to develop. Michael's legal situation was deteriorating rapidly, with criminal charges mounting and his attempts at negotiation failing. Emma's arrest had eliminated his romantic support system, while his business collapse had destroyed his professional identity. The man who thought he could manipulate and abandon me was discovering that consequences were more severe than he'd ever imagined. Saturday morning brought a call from David Walsh with news that would end Michael's last hopes for avoiding serious criminal penalties. The prosecutor's office has decided to add racketeering charges based on the pattern of fraud involving both you and his business clients. They're treating it as organized criminal activity rather than separate incidents. Racketeering charges meant Michael was facing potential decades in prison rather than the few years he might have received for simple theft. The prosecutor's decision reflected the systematic nature of his criminal behavior and the multiple victims he'd created through his deception. What happens next? His attorney will likely push for a plea agreement, but the prosecutor is in a strong position to demand significant prison time and full restitution. Morrison's attempts at delay tactics have failed, and the evidence is overwhelming. I hung up the phone and walked through my house, truly mine now in every sense that mattered. The rooms were peaceful and bright, filled with furniture and artwork that reflected my personal taste rather than the compromises that had characterized my marriage. Michael's presence had been completely erased, leaving only the life I'd built through my own efforts and intelligence. The transformation felt like waking up from a long, confusing dream into a reality that was both clearer and more promising than anything I'd experienced in years. Michael's betrayal had revealed not just his weakness but my own strength, and I was ready to embrace whatever came next with confidence in my ability to handle any challenge. 3 months later, I stood in the boardroom at Cedar Ridge Medical Center, presenting the final budget approval for our cardiac wing expansion to a room full of impressed executives. The numbers were flawless, the projections conservative but optimistic, and the funding structure I designed would ensure the project's success for decades to come. As I clicked through the final slides of my presentation, Dr. Martinez smiled. With the satisfaction of someone who'd made an excellent hiring decision 8 years ago. "Outstanding work, Sarah," he said as the board members gathered their materials. "This expansion will be your legacy at Cedar Ridge, and the board has asked me to discuss some exciting opportunities for your future here." The promotion conversation we'd been building toward for months had finally arrived, but unlike previous career discussions, this one felt entirely mine. There was no Michael in the background claiming credit for my success or minimizing my achievements to protect his own ego. My accomplishments stood alone, reflecting my intelligence and dedication without the distraction of his elaborate lies. That afternoon, I received a call from David Walsh with the news I'd been expecting for weeks. "Michael accepted the plea agreement this morning," he announced. 12 years in federal prison, full restitution of all stolen funds, and permanent forfeiture of any claim to marital assets. The prosecutor was actually somewhat generous, considering the racketeering charges could have resulted in a much longer sentence. 12 years. The number felt both enormous and appropriate for the scope of Michael's betrayal. He would serve his sentence while I rebuilt my life completely, emerging from prison to find that the world he'd tried to steal had moved on without him entirely. What about Emma? 18 months, mostly suspended, and community service in exchange for her testimony. She'll be required to pay restitution for the stolen property she received, but her cooperation was valuable in securing your husband's conviction. Emma's relatively light sentence reflected her status as a secondary participant in Michael's crimes, but it also demonstrated how quickly loyalty evaporated when self-preservation became necessary. The woman who'd written passionate love letters about their eternal devotion had ultimately saved herself by providing evidence that ensured Michael's destruction. The divorce itself had been finalized 2 weeks earlier, a brief court proceeding that formalized what had been obvious from the moment I discovered Michael's betrayal. Judge Harrison had reviewed our settlement agreement with approval, noting that the division of assets reflected both the legal reality of ownership and appropriate consequences for Michael's criminal behavior. The court finds this settlement to be fair and appropriate, she'd ruled. Mrs. Mitchell will retain all assets that were legitimately hers, while Mr. Mitchell forfeits any claim to property or funds acquired through fraud or theft. This outcome serves justice while ensuring that the victim of these crimes is not further penalized by their perpetrator's actions. Walking out of that courthouse as a free woman had felt like emerging from a long tunnel into brilliant sunshine. The weight of Michael's deception, the strain of maintaining pretenses, and the exhaustion of strategic planning were finally lifted, replaced by a sense of possibility I hadn't experienced since my early 20s. Rachel had thrown a small celebration dinner that weekend, inviting a carefully selected group of friends who'd supported me throughout the ordeal. The gathering was deliberately low-key, focused more on quiet satisfaction than dramatic vindication. We toasted not Michael's downfall but my resilience, not his punishment but my freedom. To Sarah, Rachel had said, raising her glass of champagne, who proved that intelligence and preparation will always triumph over arrogance and entitlement. The toast had been echoed around the table by friends who'd watched me navigate the crisis with a composure that had impressed everyone, including myself. I discovered reserves of strength and strategic thinking that I hadn't known I possessed, qualities that would serve me well in whatever challenges lay ahead. Lisa Park's final financial analysis had revealed the full scope of what I'd protected through my strategic planning. Michael's attempts to steal and hide assets would have cost me nearly $200,000 if they'd succeeded, money that was now safely restored to my accounts along with penalty payments and interest. Your asset protection strategy was brilliant, Lisa had observed during our final meeting. The legal structures you implemented years ago made it impossible for him to claim ownership of anything significant, despite his attempts to portray your holdings as marital property. The validation was satisfying, but more important was the knowledge that my financial security was absolute. The house, the investments, the retirement accounts I'd carefully built over years of disciplined saving were all intact and growing. Michael's criminal behavior had ultimately cost him everything while leaving me wealthier and more secure than ever. My social life had transformed in unexpected ways since the divorce. The couples we'd known during our marriage had largely faded away, uncomfortable with the criminal scandal or simply unsure how to maintain friendships that had been built around our relationship. But new connections had emerged organically. Colleagues from the hospital who'd admired my professionalism during the crisis, neighbors who'd respected my dignity throughout the ordeal, and old friends who'd reached out to offer support. The dating question had come up occasionally, usually from well-meaning friends who thought I should be getting back out there after sufficient healing time. But I felt no urgency to replace Michael with someone new. The peace of living alone, making decisions based solely on my own preferences, and not having to navigate someone else's ego or agenda was too precious to surrender quickly. Dr. Martinez had offered me the position of Chief Financial Officer for the entire Cedar Ridge health system, a promotion that would triple my responsibilities and significantly increase my salary. The role would involve overseeing financial operations for 5 hospitals and 3 outpatient centers, managing budgets that exceeded anything I'd worked with previously. You've demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking and crisis management skills we need at the system level, he'd explained during our formal interview. Your handling of the cardiac wing expansion showed remarkable foresight, and your personal resilience during difficult circumstances has impressed everyone who's worked with you. Accepting the promotion would mean leaving the individual hospital where I'd built my career, but it represented the kind of opportunity that might not come again for years. The decision felt symbolic somehow, a choice between the comfort of familiar territory and the challenge of expanding into new domains. The house had become a sanctuary in ways I hadn't anticipated. Redecorating had been an act of reclamation. replacing furniture and artwork that held memories of Michael with pieces that reflected only my personal aesthetic. The rooms now flowed with a harmony that had been impossible when every design choice required negotiation and compromise. My grandmother's jewelry, recovered from Emma after her arrest, had been restored to its place of honor in my bedroom. The sapphire necklace Michael had stolen felt different now, heavier with the weight of what it had survived but more precious for having been reclaimed. It represented not just family heritage but personal triumph over someone who'd tried to steal my history along with my future. The garden had become my particular passion during the summer months following the divorce. Working with soil and plants provided a meditative counterpoint to the analytical demands of hospital finance, and watching flowers bloom under my care felt like a metaphor for my own renewal. Michael had never shown interest in gardening, viewing it as unnecessary work that we could pay others to handle. Emma Rodriguez had disappeared from Austin entirely after completing her sentence, reportedly moving back to her hometown in East Texas to live with family while rebuilding her life. Her social media accounts had gone silent, the cheerful posts about following dreams and finding true love replaced by digital silence that spoke volumes about the reality she'd discovered. The private investigator had provided one final update about Emma's situation that felt like closing a chapter on an unpleasant story. She'd been forced to declare bankruptcy after paying restitution for the stolen property, her credit destroyed by association with Michael's crimes. The expensive lifestyle she'd flaunted on Instagram had evaporated completely, leaving her with the consequences of choices she'd probably convinced herself were romantic rather than criminal. Michael's own family had distanced themselves from him once the scope of his crimes became clear. His parents, who'd always been cordial but never particularly warm toward me, had sent a formal apology through David Walsh's office, expressing regret for their son's behavior and acknowledging that they'd been deceived about our marriage as completely as I had been. "They want you to know that they never would have supported his actions if they'd known the truth," David had relayed. "His mother specifically asked me to tell you that she's always respected your intelligence and accomplishments, and she's horrified by what Michael did to you." The gesture was unnecessary but appreciated. Michael's parents were decent people who'd raised what they thought was a successful son, only to discover that his apparent achievements had been built on lies and theft. Their embarrassment and disappointment were probably genuine, though they changed nothing about the consequences Michael would face. The media attention had gradually faded as other scandals captured public interest, but the story had established a reputation for me that extended beyond Austin's business community. I'd received speaking invitations from professional organizations interested in my perspective on financial protection and crisis management, opportunities that might never have emerged without the unwanted publicity of Michael's crimes. One particularly meaningful invitation had come from a women's business group in Dallas, asking me to speak about recognizing financial manipulation in relationships. The organizer had explained that many successful women found themselves vulnerable to partners who exploited their success while undermining their confidence. "Your story represents something important," she'd said during our planning call. "You showed that intelligence and preparation can protect against even sophisticated manipulation, and that victims can become victors when they refuse to accept the role someone else has written for them." The speaking engagement had been emotionally challenging but professionally rewarding. Sharing my experience with women who'd faced similar betrayals felt like transforming personal pain into public service, using Michael's crimes to educate others about protecting themselves from financial manipulation. Rachel had been promoted to senior partner at her law firm, recognition that had come partly through her handling of my case but mostly through years of excellent work that had finally received appropriate acknowledgement. Our friendship had deepened through the crisis, evolving from college roommates who stayed in touch to professional allies who genuinely respected each other's capabilities. "You know what I admire most about how you handled everything?" Rachel had said during one of our regular lunch meetings. You never once played the victim or asked for sympathy. You just methodically solved the problem and moved forward with your life. The observation was accurate but incomplete. I'd certainly felt like a victim during the initial discovery of Michael's betrayal, shocked and hurt by the scope of his deception. But those feelings had quickly been replaced by a more productive focus on protecting myself and ensuring that consequences followed actions. Wallowing in victimhood would have given Michael continued power over my emotional state, something I'd refused to allow. The first anniversary of my Valentine's Day discovery had passed quietly, marked only by a private moment of reflection on how completely my life had transformed. The woman who'd found those love letters in our foyer 12 months earlier had been married to a criminal without knowing it, financially vulnerable despite her professional success, and trapped in a relationship built on fundamental dishonesty. The woman I'd become was single by choice, financially secure through her own intelligence, and surrounded by people who valued her authentic self rather than the convenient fiction someone else had constructed. The transformation hadn't been easy, but it had been absolutely worth the pain of getting there. Dr. Martinez's retirement announcement had accelerated discussions about my future role at Cedar Ridge. The board had indicated that they were considering me as his potential successor, a position that would make me one of the youngest hospital executives in the state. The prospect was simultaneously exciting and daunting, representing the kind of career pinnacle I'd dreamed about but never quite believed would be accessible. You have exactly the combination of financial expertise and strategic vision we need for the challenges ahead, the board chairman had told me during a preliminary discussion. Healthcare finance is becoming increasingly complex, and we need leaders who can navigate both the technical aspects and the human elements of institutional management. The conversation had taken place in the same conference room where I'd presented budget proposals as a junior analyst years earlier, when Michael was still charming me with romantic dinners and promises of a perfect future together. The irony of potentially achieving my greatest professional success in the aftermath of my most painful personal betrayal wasn't lost on me. Michael's first letter from prison had arrived 6 months after his sentencing, forwarded through David Walsh's office as required by the restraining order that remained in effect. The letter was 5 pages of self-serving explanation mixed with what appeared to be genuine remorse, though distinguishing between authentic emotion and continued manipulation was impossible. He'd written about the harsh realities of prison life, the shame of explaining his crimes to fellow inmates, and the daily regret of destroying everything good in his life for temporary excitement. He'd claimed that losing me was a far worse punishment than incarceration, that he'd realized too late how much my love and partnership had meant to him. "I don't expect forgiveness," he'd written in closing, "but I want you to know that I understand now what I threw away. You were always too good for me, too smart and too strong, and I was too stupid and arrogant to appreciate what I had until it was gone forever." I'd read the letter once, filed it with my attorney, and never responded. Michael's belated understanding of my worth was meaningless because it had come only after he'd lost access to it. His regret might be genuine, but it changed nothing about the choices he'd made or the consequences he deserved. The house had been professionally appraised for insurance purposes, revealing that my renovations and the Austin real estate market had increased its value by nearly 40% since our purchase. The number represented not just financial growth but the tangible result of my investment in a life I'd built through my own efforts and judgment. Standing in the kitchen where I'd once cooked dinners for a husband who was stealing from me while planning his escape, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this point. Michael's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been liberating, forcing me to discover strengths I hadn't known I possessed and to build a life that was authentically mine. The evening sunlight streaming through windows I'd chosen, illuminating furniture I'd selected, in a house I'd earned through my own work, felt like the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. Michael had thought he could steal my future, but he'd only succeeded in revealing how strong that future could be when it was built on truth rather than lies. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel about weekend plans, reminding me that my calendar was now filled with people who valued my authentic self rather than the convenient fiction someone else had written. The simple pleasure of making plans, based on my own preferences, without navigating someone else's hidden agenda, still felt like a small miracle. As I prepared dinner for one in my reclaimed kitchen, I thought about the woman who discovered those love letters exactly 1 year ago. She'd believed she was uncovering evidence of her husband's betrayal, but she'd actually been discovering the first piece of evidence in her own liberation. Michael's crimes had cost him everything, but they'd given me something invaluable, absolute proof of my own strength, intelligence, and worth. The future stretched ahead with possibilities I was only beginning to explore, free from the weight of deception and compromise that had characterized my marriage. Michael would spend the next 12 years in prison, while I would spend them building something beautiful and authentic and entirely my own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up.